Hello everyone, welcome back for another video in our Security Plus and Security Essentials series. Today we're going to have a look at incident response capabilities and what you can do to make sure that you and your organization are better prepared to deal with any cybersecurity incidences that may come your way. First up, let's break down the incident response process. So firstly, an overview of the incident response process I think is in order. You've probably got a security framework that you and your organization are already following. So if that does give you an incident response process, then follow that one, obviously. However, regardless of which frameworks you may or may not be following, most of them follow a general process such as this one here, where you will go through several phases and spend most of your time in the beginning, which is preparation and detection. The idea of the preparation phase is that you don't wait till the incident to happen before you obviously get ready for one. And then once you have done your preparation and you've got maybe some monitoring and alerting capabilities set up and working for you, that's where the detection comes in. After which you move into the analyzing phase when you do detect an incident so that you can understand the nature of it and better respond to it by choosing the correct plan and response strategy. After analyze, you have contain, where you try and stop the incident from spreading and getting worse than it already is. After contain comes eradication, where you try to remove the danger and the threat. Once you've eradicated the threat, you can then recover the systems and get them back to ordinary levels of operation. And finally, reporting and reflecting. See what you can learn from the incident, as well as provide the reports that the various powers that be will need. Now, generally a very good piece of advice for incident response is once you choose to act in the analyze phase, there is no going back. So you must make sure that you're not dealing with a false positive. The only time you're allowed to go back is at certain phases. Like during recovery, you might need to go back to your detection in case the threat actor left behind any booby traps, or maybe you didn't fully detect everything that was present. And also your reporting and reflecting phase. What you learn from an actual incident, feed that into your preparation so that you are more skilled and experienced and your plans will work better going forward. I mean, let's be honest, the most realistic kind of test you can have for incident response will be an actual real incident happening. So let's move through each of these phases and talk about what types of things you need to be looking at doing here. First up, let's go to preparation. With preparation, we need to obviously make sure that we are doing our best to prevent a security incident, but we do need to make sure we've got our security infrastructure in place to do that preventative measure. After that, then we want to make sure we've got some good detective controls, because it's going to be very difficult to initiate incident response without some sort of alert or alarm. Then you also need to formulate an incident response team. You need to form one by grabbing the people in the organization that are going to be responsible for cybersecurity and assigning them roles within the team. In an ideal world, I would say an organization should have a dedicated incident response team so that they do nothing else other than prepare for an incident, refine the plans, implement and refine detective controls, and deal with the incidences when they do happen. But knowing what many organizations and employers are like, I can tell you now, you're going to get an ordinary job and then have incident response team member added as a responsibility. If that is the case, that is fine, but make sure that you want to organize your teams. And I do say teams because it will be a good idea to have more than one team, so that you can have some people on standby ready to react if an incident does occur, and then some people who get a bit of time off so they can properly enjoy their evenings and weekends away from work. Another important thing that also needs to be done when creating an incident response team is they do need to be given authority. They're going to be making decisions during incident response that under normal circumstances would probably require change management and approval and stuff like that. So they do need an authority to act against general ordinary policy and procedure. But these are extenuating circumstances that are occurring during an incident. So obviously we want them to be able to do what they need to. Also, define roles beyond technical competencies. You are going to have Obviously, people that are specialized in system administration, network administration, software development, and the various aspects of our security controls. But we do need to also have some non-technical competencies in the incident response team. I'm not saying you need to be an expert or qualified as like a lawyer for the legal expertise, but you do need to understand the legal ramifications that do occur when a security incident is taking place, especially if it is going to involve your compliance obligations in any way or form. You also want to make sure that you have some personnel and HR skill sets to handle the internal incidents with the internal threat actors, and a bit of marketing skill, because I've got some news for you. It's not a matter of if, but when the information about a breach in your organization becomes public knowledge. And you obviously want to minimize any kind of negative press that you may receive. But that's not all for preparation. We also need to make sure we're developing plans. This is probably one of the most important things that can be done, especially seen as you spend a lot of your time in the preparation and detection phases. So you want to develop an incident response plan. So generally the best way to go about creating a plan is have one general plan that will give you guidelines and overall principles no matter what kind of incident is going to happen. But the smart and intelligent way to make your incident response plans very effective is to create scenario-specific playbooks that deal with the various scenarios and situations that might arise in your organization and your cybersecurity. And don't just think about the human-driven threats, also factor in things like natural disasters, civil unrest, and stuff like that. And please don't ever think a scenario is too unrealistic. I've always joked for years that there's nothing wrong with having a scenario playbook for a zombie apocalypse. And the thing is, a lot of people would laugh at me saying, ah ha ha. But if an organization had created a scenario playbook for a zombie apocalypse, I can tell you right now, they would have known how to handle the sudden onset of a global pandemic. So even though the scenario might not be a perfect fit, the impact and the consequences of it can be aligned with other scenarios you might not have gotten around to planning for yet. Also, while creating those scenarios, it's usually a good idea to do your worst case scenarios first, because while you're still working through all the various scenarios and levels of them, if one of those incidences does happen, hopefully you've already worked on the worst case scenario of that incident and you've got your plans in place. The goal here is that the playbooks are going to give you the details of what to do in the situation, whereas the general incident response plan is more a case of what should you do in general for an incident response activity. Now, we also need to plan and prepare things like a communication structure. This way we can try and minimize on inadvertent and premature disclosure of the incident to the stakeholders, the public, and obviously the attacker as well. What will help here is to have a predetermined list of stakeholders that you need to contact so that you can inform them, hey, there's an incident taking place and the following is going to happen. Now, when it comes to that list of stakeholders, I generally do advise that you make them very well aware that the information that they will be given during a real incident is of a sensitive nature and they do not really have the right or authority to disclose that information ahead of time. It is for the incident response team and the marketing department and senior security leadership to decide when that information gets shared. You might even need to use non-disclosure agreements to help enforce this. Please be aware, non-disclosure agreements do not prohibit somebody from talking, but they definitely outline some agreed consequences if they do. Another important thing as well when you're doing your communication plan is it needs to be treated as a need-to-know sharing system. That means you need to decide when you're looking at the stakeholder who needs to know to be able to help with the incident response process, even if it means them doing nothing so that they don't cause any more problems or hassles or delays in incident response. What do they need to know, and when do they need to know about the incident? Not want to know, need to know. Once the incident is all finished and concluded and everything's recovered and restored, then you can have more widespread sharing about the incident and the details of it. And also, you need to consider an out-of-band communication plan. Just in case the attacker has compromised your primary communication channels, you want to give them as little insight into your incident response process as possible. Now, once you've got your plans in place and you are ready, you could look at moving into the detection phase, where our main goal here is to pick up on the incident as early on as possible. This is where things like our logging systems can help us a lot with giving us alerts about the unusual and strange circumstances that could be occurring within your network. You could be looking at systems deviating from known good benchmarks and baselines without a reasonable cause, obviously. If, for instance, it's financial year end and your employer is listed on the stock exchange, I can promise you you're going to see some unusually high activity, especially in the financial section within your network. But if you see a sudden burst of activity in the financial sector and there is no major financial calendar event taking place anytime soon, like financial year end for a stock exchange listed organization, you now need to look into that. Also, manually detecting and looking into your alerts and weird things can help a lot as well. Outside intelligence sources can be a fantastic source as well for knowing that this might be a popular type of attack right now, and we can adjust our focus to deal with maybe a DDoS if that is what is currently very popular at the moment. And we obviously are going to take insight and information from our users, also known as internal reporting. When your users observe something strange that could be indicative of an attack, we obviously want to pay attention to that and investigate it. Rather look into it and see it was nothing and an overreaction looking into it, than to assume, what does the user know? And find out, oopsie, there actually was an incident and the user was right. And public reporting as well. Your customers might notice something wrong. Like, for example, they might notice your website was defaced before you do. And that gives you your alert to determine you need to work on this. You also might have a first responder dealing with the system, and they might be the one to determine this is a security incident underway. And that first responder may be an ordinary desktop support technician. So make sure that you do help your desktop support technicians with incident response to know how to recognize a security incident within your organization and how to escalate appropriately, and also what the first response actions should probably be. These will obviously vary from organization to organization, which is why I leave it open for you to interpret what they should be looking for and what the escalation process should look like. But once you've detected an incident, you need to look at analyzing it and understanding what's going on. You are going to have to do rapid analysis here. So you're not going to have the luxury of time to properly interpret everything and make your determinations. But what you're after here from a rapid analysis is to classify the nature of the incident, figure out the priority in terms of how severe is this and what is it affecting of yours, what the impact is going to be if it hasn't already been measured, so that you can know, okay, cool, this is either a severe or a minor incident. You also want to see if you can pick up on the scope of the incident, which systems and how many of them have possibly been affected, and also those that have been affected, to what extent have they been compromised. The idea of the analysis is so that when you do decide to move forward with incident response, after this step, there is no turning back. Once initiated, you don't want to stop. And the reason why is a lot of attackers will do their best to try and trip you up during the analysis phase of incident response, trying to fool you into believing this is a false positive so that you actually give up and stop. But the goal here is we don't want to fall for that. So when we decide this is an incident, after we move past this phase, there is no going back. We see it through to completion. First main step when you're dealing with an incident is to contain it. You do not want it to spread or get bigger. That way you can prevent further systems falling victim and going offline, thus decreasing the impact and consequences for the organization, at least during the incident response up until the recovery phase can begin. Now please be aware that with containment you are going to run into some potential issues. For example, you might lose control during the containment phase. The attacker might be using a dead man switch, where if the malware ceases to communicate with the attacker's command and control server, it might do something severe and significant that could lead to things like loss of control, or worse yet, loss of evidence. This will obviously have a forensic impact, and we are going to talk a little bit about cyber forensics in this video. But your other issues might also include an SLA violation. If the compromised system is something that you require to provide a service to a customer or a consumer of some kind, and to contain the incident, you've got to take it offline, you are going to probably be violating that customer's availability requirements of you. So please understand consequences of SLAs before you deactivate and block certain things from taking place. You also could potentially be interfering with system dependencies. You might have something that's unrelated to the system that depends on the system you are about to restrict and possibly quarantine. And now that thing that depends on what you're about to quarantine is not going to work. So containment, although as sensible as it sounds, is not as easy to do sometimes and can have severe consequences that may or may not be worse than the actual incident taking place. But once you have contained, the next logical step is to get rid of the threat. We want to be removing the malware and any malicious configurations that might be present. We also ideally want to try and remove the exploited vulnerability so that lightning does not strike twice in the same place. Fun fact, lightning actually does strike twice in the same place, and if you do not remove the vulnerability that the attacker exploited, they will try again once they think you've let your guard down. Ideally, you want to try and remove this vulnerability permanently, but if a temporary removal is all you can get right, then so be it. You also might want to review your security controls to make sure that they are working properly if they were deactivated or bypassed in some way. And you might want to start considering reconstituting some lost data to get system functionality back. The data we're talking about here is not necessarily the data that people are working with, but the files that would affect how the system behaves and works. Now, please be aware that if you contain the incident and you believe the incident to be a cybercrime, you have to stop after the containment phase and begin forensics before you can eradicate the threat, as the eradication process is most likely to lead to evidence loss occurring. Now we're going to look at reporting and reflecting at the end of an incident. The idea of reporting and reflecting is that we are going to be generating reports for our stakeholders so that they can appreciate what happened, they can understand why it happened, and possibly more likely grant permission for us to do something to mitigate this from happening in the future. It'll probably be a good idea to create different reports to cater for different stakeholder types, mainly in terms of their ability to understand the technicalities of the incident, as well as the actual information they need to know about the incident. So you're going to have a technical report, obviously, for the IT practitioners and the senior people in the technical space, like the CIO or the CSO or the CTO or whatever fancy job title people have now. You also might want the managerial control for the stakeholders in managerial roles who are not necessarily that interested in the technicalities of what happened with the incident. You'll also probably need to create a compliance report so that you can ensure your compliance with any regulatory authorities that do require disclosure during or after an incident has occurred. And because it's gonna happen, create a public report as well, so that you can be the entity that first breaks the news. It's not going to be great for your public image, but I can promise you this much: if the organization discloses the incident to the public rather than some random person posting it online, the better off you're going to be for it. Plus, you get to control the narrative as well, rather than making the customers think you are trying to hide something or cover up some heinous incompetency. Then, the report for us that you want to create is a lessons learned report. You can test as much as you like, in as many different ways as you like, to prepare for incident responses, to make sure that your plans and your processes are going to work. But there's going to be no better test than a real incident occurring. So you want to try and take as much away from this to improve your incident response for the next time as much as you can. So first up, we want to do root cause analysis. We want to get down to the absolute crux of what happened, how the attacker pulled it off. Were they opportunist or were they specifically targeting us? You want to know as much about the actual base cause of what occurred. Then you also want to look at reviewing your responses. You want to look at what was done and what were the effects of what was done. And you want to try and figure out what didn't work, obviously, but also what did work. Now, I'm not adding the what did work to be all lovey-dovey, cuddly and make us all feel better. Although it does actually make you feel a bit more positive while you're doing this. But the idea here is to get to the reporting and the reflecting stage, you had to have got something right in your incident response. Otherwise, you wouldn't be at this stage right now. And some things had to have gone right. So what did go right? Okay. Why did that go right? If you can answer that, you can take that answer and apply it to what went wrong and what didn't work out very well. It'll work out beneficial in the long run, I promise. So as soon as I spoke a bit about testing and validating your incident response plans and that, let's talk about testing and training. This technically is part of preparation, but you might make this an extra phase. It's up to you. But the idea is that you want to validate that your incident response plans are going to work and that you get people familiar with what is in them. Otherwise, you're going to have people doing incident response for the first time who are going to be a little bit unsure about what to do, even if the plans and documentation is already in place. Familiarity with the plan will occur through actually practicing. Now, there's a variety of testing methods you can look at using. You've got tabletop exercises, where we sit around a boardroom table and discuss our way through an incident and the response. This might lack realism, but you can work through several scenarios very quickly, and any massive logical flaws in how this would be done will be very easily detected. Then we could start moving on to more realistic kinds of tests, like lab exercises, where you build a test environment to invoke an incident and test the response. Being a lab exercise, obviously it's very, very idealized because you set up the test in such a way so that you can actually implement the incident response. But it definitely will help you find any issues with the actual usage of your controls and tools and get people familiar with those controls and tools that they might be using during incident response. Then we're going to step it up a little bit in realism. A walkthrough exercise. The best way to think of the walkthrough exercise is where the incident response team is going to go through the motions of incident response, but they're not going to commit the actions. The idea is that we want to see how feasible the task is, especially when it comes to timing, travel, and anything that involves things happening in the real world. An example might be that as part of incident response, you're meant to go and retrieve the offsite backup, for instance. And what would be a good idea is somebody travels to that offsite backup location, takes a selfie with it, and drives back. The reason for the selfie is just to make sure the person didn't park off around the corner and have a nap. But the idea is to see the feasibility of retrieving that media. And you'd obviously try and pick times and dates where it would definitely be more challenging than any other time, so that you can see, would your ability to get a backup in 20 minutes be fair, or would it be impossible during peak hour traffic? Another consideration is also to wargame the scenarios. With wargaming, what's happening is you are bringing along a somewhat real threat actor, like a pen test team, to ethically hack your systems, and you have your incident response team react to them. We discussed this briefly a couple of videos back, but I can promise you it will help a lot to give the incident response team a real threat actor to work on. If the concern around having a war game on production is too much for you, you could always create labbed environments or simulated environments so that the war game can take place there. And then we could obviously look at doing a full-on simulation where we do invoke a real incident in production. Please be aware though, this is the last kind of test you want to perform, because if there were going to be any problems or shortcomings in your incident response plan, you want to pick up on them as early on as possible, because when you invoke the disaster or incident that's going to be tested, you want to have every confidence that the plan is going to work. So make sure that you've tried every other test and practicing method before getting to a simulation. And you know what? If your organization's nervous about it still, then there's no obligation to do it. I've come across many a situation where companies, businesses, government sectors, and so forth were quite comfortable doing all the other kinds of tests and training, but doing a simulation on production was too risky for them. If that's the case, that's okay. Now, we also got a very cool idea for threat hunting as a detection aid, because with threat hunting, we're going to go on the assumption that we've already been breached, that the attacker is already here. Now, it's not a pleasant way to live to assume you've already been attacked, but it's actually a very good thing to try, because you'll discover vulnerabilities in a natural way. You'll get ideas about how attackers could work through your environment and stuff like that. Or we're assuming the alerting failed or the attacker managed to avoid detection. Either way, though, we're letting the assumption that something's already happened win. And what happens is we could start discovering new threat types, new vulnerabilities, new risks, and we might even actually uncover indicators of compromise for an advanced persistent threat actor that might have targeted us in the recent past. So this will help us a lot. Plus, we're going to be generating internal intelligence. And when it comes to internal intelligence, this is amazingly helpful because it is very, very relevant. When it comes to analyzing security intelligence that comes from outside the organization, you have to worry about applying context and making sure that you are not reacting to something that is irrelevant to you or your organization. So by generating your own internal intelligence, by hunting down and assuming that you've already been compromised, you are going to be in a better position for all of this. Now, this is your overall incident response process, but I did say that if a cybercrime is what's happened, we have to stop our response process just before we start eradicating and recovering and implement cyber forensics. As with a cybercrime, we need to be able to create evidence. And without that evidence, we're going to have a tough time identifying and prosecuting the perpetrator. And even if they are internal, you still need to consider generating evidence if this could land up in court. So let's move into due process and figure out what we need to consider for cyber forensics. So incident response and due process will be invoked when an incident is criminal in nature. And it is likely to cause you to pause your incident response, as I've said already, normally around the containment phase, assuming containment will not affect evidence, which you'll understand about just now, the different ways that evidence can be affected. We're going to be focused on gathering evidence, analyzing it, and reporting evidence with the goal of prosecuting the cyber criminal, or at least creating evidence that will help us prosecute a cyber criminal. Now, due process is, by defined, the method of gathering, preserving, and presenting evidence in such a way that it will be admissible in court. Just for clarification, I said admissible, which means valid, legit, it'll be fine. It's the inadmissible that you always hear about in the TV shows and the movies whenever there's some sort of legal thing happening. Now, legal hold may have to be invoked as well. Legal hold is where you have the legal right to seize the whole physical system as evidence, which means you may need to include clauses in your bring your own device policy so that you can seize an employee's personal phone that they're using at work for work, or their laptop or whatever. So if there is any evidence on a device, it can be seized, and if that device is personally owned, you need to make sure there is a clause that covers that in the policies. This is one of the reasons why you might want to make sure that your users fully understand the ramifications of BYOD and that they sign a policy. They don't just read it and acknowledge it, they sign it, that they understood it. Now, the whole thing about forensics is to gather and analyze evidence. So let's get that gathering done first, because that is going to make the big difference to whether your security efforts and your forensic response is going to be successful in identifying and prosecuting the attacker, if you can. So first of all, what's the computer's state? It must be noted. Is it still running? Has it been turned off? Has it been rebooted? Or anything like that? Because if the device has power cycled or rebooted or anything like that, the contents of RAM are flushed. Remember, RAM is volatile storage. No power, no data. And that means that any temporary files in RAM are now gone. And that might have been the only copy of some evidence. Also, with power cycling, sometimes there are going to be some temporary files on the machine's hard drive or SSD or whatever it is it's using for main storage that will also get wiped out after a reboot or two. So you do need to know, has that machine had a reboot? That way you know whether anything in RAM is actually worth looking at or not. The next thing is collecting that evidence. Forensic investigators will normally act in order of volatility, which means they're going to go for things like cache memory on the CPU and RAM first, because those two are the most likely to be lost without power. And then they'll go for the temporary files on the storage of the machine. After that, they'll want to capture all of the normal files on the drive, which normally involves creating a clone of the drive. And then they'll look for anything remotely stored, like log data that might have been forwarded to a central logging server or a SIEM solution. And then physical stuff like printed media would be checked next. But let's dig deeper on that RAM evidence a bit for a moment, because RAM evidence is super interesting and super helpful. So RAM evidence will sometimes be the only copy of the data that the attacker may have left behind. They might have cleared the stuff on the hard drive, but there might still be something lingering in memory. So there are utilities that allow us to capture and save the contents of RAM. I don't want to make any recommendations about utilities in case it's not the right fit for you. But there are plenty out there. You just need to look at RAM capturing utilities and you'll probably find a load of interesting things on Google. Some of which will be free and open source, which will be pretty damn sweet. But when you do settle on trying out some tools for gathering evidence in RAM, please play with that tool. Learn how it works so that you understand how to use it, first of all. And secondly, so that you can understand how it may impact the contents of RAM. As the utility itself is an executable that's going to run, it may get loaded into RAM and possibly affect some of the evidence. And if you are going to have to deal with a forensic report and court, you need to be able to explain the way the tool worked so that you can argue that it did not affect the evidence that proves Bob was the person who did the attack. Sorry, Bob, I keep picking on you. Then you have to make sure that your system cannot have a reboot. Otherwise, any latent evidence is going to be lost. This is why backup power gets quite a lot of attention on systems that are likely to be targeted by an attacker, so that it's a bit harder for that thing to experience a reboot without you being able to have a chance to capture anything useful or sensitive. And a common approach is just to grab everything that's in RAM as quickly as you can. You can worry about sorting out the evidence from arbitrarily ordinary data later. Just grab it all. Don't try and figure out, oh, that's the evidence. Grab it, save it, figure it out later. That way you know you didn't miss anything that was in RAM. Then when it comes to your permanent storage, your hard drives and SSDs, normally what we'll have being done here is an image being created of that drive. So this is our permanent non-volatile storage, and we will try to do a live acquisition where we don't have to turn the device off. That is preferred because then any temporary files were left unaffected, because we don't want to lose those as they are super useful. Now you might have a imaging utility though that can't do a live acquisition. So play around, look around for a good cloning utility. Please note I'm using the word cloning here because it's not a simple copy of everything on a hard drive. The utility needs to be able to clone or recreate all of the data operations on the hard drive that led to its current state. This would include if a file has been deleted. Because, fun fact, when you delete a file on a computer, it's not gone forever. All you're doing is you're telling the file system that that little sector of storage can now be overwritten. But as most storage media has some sort of wear leveling logic in its firmware, it'll try and make sure other sections of storage are used first so that everything gets used and worn out equally over time. So deleted files are recoverable, but not to the file system. So you need to make sure your imaging utility is going to do this for you. That it's going to recreate even the sectors of storage that seemingly have no files. Now, this can actually allow you to do data recovery on deleted files even after you've cloned it to another media. So that's pretty awesome. But once you've done cloning, you must make sure that the destination drive you're writing it to can be write protected once you've completed that cloning. That way the evidence cannot be modified thereafter. You want to ensure that anything that you do save is write protected, but especially the disk image. Which leads me on to our evidence preservation concerns. So we are going to want to make sure that our evidence is gathered properly, it is kept as safe as possible, and it hasn't been tampered with, and we can prove that. So what we're going to do? Well, first of all, we're going to follow chain of custody. This is going to be a process that we're going to follow to maintain the integrity of our evidence. Chain of custody is going to probably end up requiring a few things of us, like making sure that we've got tamper-evident bags and boxes to store our evidence in. Please note, tamper-evident, not tamper-proof. Nothing is truly anything-proof, really. But the idea is that we'll be able to tell when this bag has been opened. Now, usually what we want to do to make it tamper-evident is that we'll have little stickers going over the seals of the bags and the boxes, that when we do need to break that seal, we place a new one over it and write any details that are relevant there, so that the sheriff of the courts or whoever at the courtroom is going to help review the evidence and present it in the court can see that there is no unexplained and untracked openings of the packaging. They'll also probably align it with a chain of custody document, which we'll talk about just now. Then we also need to ensure that where we store our evidence is physically secure as well. We don't want somebody sneaking in and tampering with it, no matter what the reason is. Even if the CEO says we need to let them have a look at the evidence in case there's anything to do with an affair they might be having, tough luck. We don't jeopardize the validity and admissibility of our evidence, even if it does mean that CEO might end up having a very unpleasant time with their better half. We must also always log and track that access. This needs to align with any evidence stickers used to prove the bags have been opened and closed at these dates and times. Access logs must be kept. And as I've already mentioned, you want to use write once media. WORM media is shorthand for write once, read many. The idea is once written, we don't want to have tampering and changes taking place. You actually do get specialized hard drives for this, where it has a write blocker that gets plugged in and cannot be removed without damaging the drive. So you might want to consider having some of those on hand if you are going to do your own forensics internally rather than calling in an external consultant. The external consultants will probably have this media themselves. And then we want to try and create a timeline for that chain of custody where we track who had access to it from the moment we discovered the incident to when we present it to the courts for prosecution purposes. The timeline of the chain of custody must be all the way from the moment we realize this is a cybercrime up until the evidence now becomes the problem of the courts. We also want to make sure that we are noting what the person did as well. Not just who had access and when and so forth, but what they did. That will help us identify any possible weaknesses or flaws in the evidence's admissibility. And we are obsessed about the integrity and the non-repudiation of our evidence. So crazy things will be done to prove that the data that we gathered is exactly what we gathered. So we can use things like hashing and checksums to prove our evidence has not been changed. Remember, if I hash a file and I change one binary bit, that completely changes the output of the hash value when I redo the hashing. The same can be done with ordinary checksum utilities as well. And a very good idea will be to record the gathering of the evidence, preferably via video, so that you can prove this is how we did it, this is what was done, and this is what was on the screen. The first two are meant to validate each other from two slightly different perspectives, but you want to start the second camera about 5 minutes after you start the first one, and then start doing things. That way, when you have to swap out memory cards for the first camera, the second one is still rolling and proves that there's no gap in the footage. And then the third camera, you might want to have that moving around, going close up to the screen so that you can say, hey, there's the hash value. And obviously you do a screenshot as well to make it more legible. And that will help validate that the evidence is exactly what we had when we gathered it. I know we got deep fakes and AI video editing and stuff like that, but we do our best to prove that this is exactly what we did. Besides which, you can at least see sometimes when it is a faked video. And then we create duplicates of evidence. The idea of the duplicates is we want to keep one permanently for evidence and never touch it, unless we want to make a second copy or another copy for analysis purposes. So you always have one copy that is only used to make other copies and is the original evidence that will be given over. And then comes the forensic reporting process. Now, as I said, the forensic analysts are probably going to be either in-house or more than likely an external consultant that's brought in as and when needed. And the forensic analysts will be providing their analysis and reporting to the victim entity and to the courts. So the analysts will be involved in the prosecution if we are able to successfully identify. So they must be prepared for that testifying in court. The downside is, though, that evidence gathered during a cybercrime might not be enough to identify, and if you can identify, prosecute the cybercriminal. So this is a bit of an annoying thing. But we can collaborate with other victim organizations because they might have the missing pieces to the puzzle that we need to either prove the identity or prove the guilt. Or if the attacker repeatedly attacks you, previous cybercrime evidence might help supplement the current incident that you are busy resolving and dealing with. But please be aware that cyber forensic analysis is a pretty advanced skill set, and LPR Security Essentials doesn't really get into this. CompTIA addresses this throughout several of their security-focused courses, but at no point does any of CompTIA's certifications actually qualify you as a cyber forensic analyst. Even CompTIA's cybersecurity analyst, or CISA Plus, doesn't actually make you a forensic analyst. There are more specialized vendors and courses for this. But now let's go back to ordinary incident response, like dealing with data sources for indicators of attack. What can we use to help identify and determine we have an attack and begin our incident response? So first of all, let's check out our system reports. What can our systems help us with in terms of detecting and responding sooner? Well, as always, log data is an amazingly useful thing that can help us. Now, the kinds of logs that you want to pay attention to try and get indicators of attack, or IOAs, will be your network logs, as a lot of threat actors will be coming in over the network. Either they'll be on-prem using the LAN, or they'll be coming in remotely over the internet. Nonetheless though, network logs, super useful. Then, general operating system log utilities will also help us identify unusual and deviant behavior that needs to be alerted and focused on for incident response. Any applications and services that are crucial and critical to the mission essential and important operations should be paid attention to as a logging source. Any sort of endpoint protection platform that you have running should help you. And also, your building access control can help you identify potential threats and risks there. Now, you can utilize the Windows Event Viewer as a logging source for Windows-based systems, especially Windows servers. And then in the case of Linux, you have syslog and maybe application-specific logs that you would have a look at. And because you might have some of your operations hosted with a cloud service provider, they hopefully have some sort of logging and report utility that you can rely upon to know about any indicators of attack that might be taking place with your cloud-hosted operations and assets. In terms of the appliances that could be useful sources to you, you can have your intrusion detection system and prevention systems drawing alerts to you. Obviously, as we discussed in a previous video where we looked at how they work, make sure that you do understand the scanning method that your IDS or IPS uses, and also that you have been refining their alerting process to minimize on false positives. Your firewall also can be a useful alerting source, assuming the attacker did not find a way to circumvent or bypass. If you're relying on the IDS and IPS, that means you do have some doubts about the chance of your firewall successfully alerting you. Then you have your general network appliances that can also provide alerts and log sources for you to react to, such as your routers, your switches, and your wireless access points, or whatever is helping to manage those if you are using a cool wireless LAN controller of some kind. And then most obviously, your most valuable endpoints, your servers. Their logging and alerting capability will definitely be very valuable, especially if the attacker has successfully gotten past most of your network security thus far. Client logs and alerts should also be considered as well. Just remember though, you're going to have a lot of end users who are going to do weird things, so you might want to have a lot of alerts being ignored with a client log. Or maybe you pick certain client type devices like senior managers or departmental heads to be the source for those alerts, as they're probably going to be the more likely to be targeted users. And then if you have a security information and event management platform, or DLP, can help you be alerted to these threats. We're going to talk a little bit more about a SIEM later on in this video and a DLP in another video. So let's move along. Your threat hunting sources can also be incredibly helpful. External intelligence helps a lot with this. Inspections of your systems when you're doing threat hunting, like looking for odd network activity, suspicious user accounts, or any sort of access records that don't make sense, like time of the day, day of the week, and stuff like that, could be very useful. Also, looking at file metadata around deleted files or edited files could be very useful. Reviewing your email server, looking for strange communications logs or new accounts that were created without an HR record, can all be very, very useful. Now, these sources discussed, let's look at using some alerting and monitoring solutions. And now for one of my favorites, the SIEM solution, or the Security Information and Event Management Platform. With a SIEM solution, this is a very elegant, sophisticated, and complex to deploy monitoring and alerting solution. Its primary purpose is to collect logs and aggregate them. What I mean by that is we're going to be sending all our logs to the system, and it is going to basically standardize them and correlate them to draw our attention to events that might previously have not been noticed if we relied on ordinary logging and alerting. but not with a centralized intelligence system. The big advantage is it helps us correlate logs from different and disparate sources. For instance, you might have a salesperson travel to another country and VPN in on a regular basis. Cool. This salesperson is now overseas, remoting into the workplace. But half an hour later, building access control system detects their access card being used to enter head office where you're at right now. One of those two events is not legit. Which it is, I don't know. But without a SIEM solution correlating these logs from different sources, it would be a lot harder for us to detect this suspicious, impossible scenario of the person being in another country and half an hour later swiping into head office. This impossible travel scenario should be our attention-grabbing situation. The SIEM is also going to help with the analysis as well and alerting us to the criteria that we define for it as what is an event combination worth alerting us to. And this does a lot to helping us because it is automation support for analysis and alerting. And that is great because it means we don't rely on the human being to be keyed in all the time and be alert all the time. Keeping the incident responders' minds fresher for longer. I think it's wonderful. It also helps with the report generation. SIEM solutions are fantastic at generating some nice reports for us, especially technical reports. And even if I am planning to still edit and modify, it's nice to have the meat and potatoes of the report done for me, and then the garnishing is left up to me or you or any normal human being to make it look pretty and correct for whoever we're going to present this report to. It's wonderful. SIEM solutions also do support data archiving as well, so that we can keep the logs and event alerts kept safe for long periods of time. In the event that we discover an advanced persistent threat actor, months or worse yet, years after the event. And what I personally love is that those modern SIEMs that we're seeing nowadays have visual dashboards. This is great, again, for the people who are going to watch the SIEM dashboard, as it is easier to spot a graphical change, click on that graphical element, and investigate the data behind that visual information. We as human beings react better to visual stimuli than text stimuli. Older SIEM solutions used to have text running across a screen, which was mind-numbingly boring to sit and look at all day long. Whereas some line graphs, some charts, bar graphs, whatever, that fluctuate are going to draw your attention a lot quicker and a lot more effectively. Now, this sounds great, SIEMs sound amazing, but the deployment will take a significant amount of time to do. It's best to do the full integration of a SIEM in phases. Take your time, get little bits at a time done, get that server enrolled, get that segment of the data center working with a SIEM, you get the idea. Take your time, roll it out in phases, so that if there's any problems or any blind spots, it's a lot easier to isolate and resolve them when you're focusing on little portions of the whole organization. Also, it's going to take a while after integration for people to learn and master the chosen platform. So I would advise that before you even begin the deployment, take some time and experiment with different SIEM products. Free and open source will be an easy starting point, but if you're going for commercial and licensed, then take full advantage of trial periods and possibly negotiate with a licensed SIEM vendor to maybe have an extended trial available to you so you can better determine if it's good or not. Because you don't want to have a security professional spending a lot of time mastering the SIEM platform and then you change it out 2 years later for something else. Also, you're going to have to refine your alert criteria all the time. It's inevitable you're going to have false alarms and floods of alarms taking place. So you're going to be refining your alert criteria all the time. Identifying new alerts that you want and maybe toning down the sensitivity of existing alerts that you've already defined. This is basically what we call alert tuning, where we're trying to continually refine the detection rules. You're never done making the SIEM work better, but you will get it to a point, probably within 2 to 3 years, where it's adding a huge amount of value to your monitoring and reaction efforts. You also want to make sure that you define muted alert levels or low consequence issues. Like for instance, a user who keeps locking themselves out but doesn't seem to be doing so in a suspicious way, you might want to mute those alerts. You'd rather have the user that's locked themselves out continually and then suddenly gains access being the alerted criteria. Also, when an incident does occur, you need to redirect the alert floods that are going to come your way. Normally when an incident begins and you react to the first response, further alerts are going to be triggered, either by the attacker or by the response effort. So you need to make sure that you can redirect the alert floods so that they get sent to the correct folder, view, whatever it is that the SIEM uses, so that it doesn't distract you anymore from the current incident you're dealing with. You also want to make sure that you're passing the alerts to the relevant specialists, so that network alerts go to the network specialist, database alerts go to the database specialist. You get the idea. Another thing to consider as well with your alert tuning is maybe get some machine learning, real AI, to help you with looking at the alerts and determining if they're valid or not before a human operator sees it. And the human operator gets the final call on whether this really is an incident or a false positive that the machine learning now needs to be on the lookout for. This can do a lot to help improve your SIEM's effectiveness. And you can also have security intelligence feeding into the SIEM to add new alert criteria for new and emerging threats and attack methodologies. Now, besides our SIEMs, we also want to have some good network monitoring in place. Logging into your appliance and just running various status check commands can be very helpful to determine if something's going on weird in your network, especially if maybe a user report of poor network performance has drawn your attention to a certain network appliance or segment within the LAN. You could also take advantage of many network appliances and services using heartbeat messages to keep an eye on the health and status of a network appliance or the connections between them. SNMP can also help you a lot with monitoring on your network, as we've discussed in previous videos, and doing traffic flow and volume analysis of your whole network would be very useful. Now, to do this, you're going to need either a tool like NetFlow or IPFix to be able to collect performance statistics from a variety of network appliances and give you an overview of how much of your network is in use, what protocol proportions are making up that use, stuff like that. Being able to monitor the utilization of your entire network is going to be massively helpful here. And you also want to make sure that you do make measurements and benchmarks here, but keep track of the context. The time of the day of the week, period of the month, the period of the year, all of this will affect traffic volumes. For instance, an organization that operates Monday to Friday, I expect to see the network being very quiet over the weekend. And an organization that normally operates 5 days a week, if there's a public holiday of some kind or a bank holiday or whatever it is called in your country, that day is going to be quiet. So make sure that you do have context measurements for all of those kinds of scenarios, because it does affect how your network's performing. With our system monitoring, we can look at, again, log reviews and alerts on the system direct, not relying on it being forwarded to something like a SIEM. We could also review historical logs, looking for past attacks, hinting at the threat hunting again here. We could also check out our application logs and debug files if the application does have its own debug method. Your cloud provider will have a monitor for any of your cloud-hosted systems that you can keep an eye on. Your vulnerability scanner results can also be a fantastic way to identify suspicious things, like, for instance, attackers trying to do a downgrade or patch reversal attack, where you're suddenly seeing more vulnerabilities than you should. A fantastic thing to have alerting you and drawing your attention to the occurrence on that system. Any sort of alerts you get from an anti-malware solution, and anything you get from a data loss prevention solution, which we will talk about in a later video in this series, will be helpful for system monitoring. Another clever idea that is becoming very popular nowadays is a Canary system. A Canary system? Yes. This is a system that is set up to be very, very fragile and easily affected by the attacker. You can make it a partial honeypot if you want to try and make sure the attacker is likely to go there and trigger it, but it's not always necessary. It just needs to be sensitive enough that the attacker will trigger it. And the Canary system going offline is meant to draw the attention of our incident response team. Now, you will get false positives because we are setting this thing up to be a fragile system that goes offline and draws our attention to a problem. But we accept this because we are trying to use it to detect the attacker. And we're going to try and minimize on the false positives, obviously. But if we are going to affect the Canary system sensitivity, then we're not going to try and avoid minimizing that false positive. Any minimization of false positives must be done so without affecting sensitivity of the Canary system. And you can actually go online and search for Canary systems and maybe even find pre-built Linux images that can be deployed on machines that can become a Canary system for you. Believe you me, anything I talk about here, I bet you can find a pre-built solution already. But that is all I have for you with incident response. I would like to thank you for watching, and if you have any friends, family members, or colleagues that would be interested in the series, feel free to share it with them. If you haven't already done so, subscribe, like, and maybe bookmark this playlist so that you can find the future videos more easily when I upload them. If you want to support the channel, please be aware I've got a Patreon. I haven't got any special rewards there just yet. Or if you want to support me a bit more directly, you can also throw some cryptocurrencies at me as well. My Bitcoin and Ethereum addresses are in the description below. Otherwise though, I'd like to thank you again for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.